Good morning. Welcome back to the Retirement Report. I'm Hank Parrott, your host. With me, my good friend, special guest, Russ Cook with Russ Cook and Associates over in Brentwood, Tennessee. Russ is a board-certified estate planning attorney, and that's all he does is estate planning. This is, of course, tax planning and the things that go with that, but he's not involved in other areas of law like, I don't know, litigation, divorce, those kind of things. He specializes and focuses on estate planning, so he really knows his stuff when it comes to estate planning. One of the things, in fact, we were talking about revocable trusts and how they work, and how you can utilize those with, and Russ talked about the difference between utilizing your plain vanilla, we'll call it, revocable living trust and a community property trust, and some of the advantages that could have with your financial planning down the road for that surviving spouse. Well, another is there are other types of trusts, and by the way, that's creating what it would be then at the passing of that first spouse. It's created an irrevocable living trust. And Russ, let's talk about irrevocable living trust. What that means, or irrevocable trust, when you've set up in your trust that it's going to leave it to someone. The trust that then becomes, you've got a, well, with the community's property part, you could have a revocable piece where the wife can change that part, and an irrevocable piece where that she's not only getting this step up, but she's also getting some asset protection.
Yes. So a lot of times when we create an estate plan, it will be a combination of revocable and irrevocable trust type agreements. And it may start out that the client has a joint revocable trust, community property trust, that both spouses can revoke at any point in time. And then when the one spouse dies, in order to protect the deceased spouse's half of the inheritance, it will drop down into an irrevocable trust that's already laid out in the revocable trust agreement that it's going to happen, with the survivor as the trustee and the survivor as the beneficiary. The question is, well, why at the first spouse's death should their share go into a trust that the survivor can't revoke? Well, the point is you don't want the assets to be subject to the survivor's creditors. And so if it's irrevocable, then that means the creditors can't try to push through the survivor in a way that gets at the trust assets. However, the survivor is usually the trustee and beneficiary of that trust. So in practical terms, they have a lot of control over that trust, almost to the extent of what they would have if they had inherited those assets outright.
There you go. So you can utilize this, and you've created an asset protection wrapper around half of your assets to help protect their surviving spouse. You've given them some tax advantages with the step up in basis that allows them more flexibility in terms of taking care of their income needs. All of this within this trust, okay? Now you can also we can extend that further now. So beyond the couple, now we look to the next one. When both are gone, what do we want to have happen with what's left there? And now we want it to go to the children. Now we have two choices. We can, of course, well, maybe a number of choices, but the two we're going to talk about, one is that you leave it outright to the children. It just says, okay, just like with a will, right? You leave it to them and they can deal with it any way they want. Now, in many families we deal with, sometimes there are special circumstances where maybe that's not in the child's best interest. It's an adult child. Maybe they're, they may be in their 50s or 60s and still not be really good with money and maybe need a little bit of help with that. There are ways that, and even if they're really good with money, there's still the issues that they may deal with regard to having protections. So let's give you an example. Russ, let's talk about, for instance, one of the most common things that we see here is we set up a trust. We want to go in trust to the children. They're going to be in charge of their own trust, so they've got all the controls we were just talking about a surviving spouse would have. But now one of the things in particular that can come into play, and it's very prevalent, unfortunately, I guess, is that of divorce. So and the concern about protecting those assets that you've left to your children. If that in-law becomes an outlaw, you want to make sure that they don't walk away with your money, that you want to stay with your children and ultimately maybe on down to your grandchildren and so on. So let's talk about how the trust works that way.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the fact that this is probably the most common way that we're setting up beneficiary distribution. So in most cases where a client might come to us and say, hey, we trust our kids, we think they're financially savvy, they can get their inheritance outright. And then we'll start talking about, well, what if they receive it and then get divorced 5 years later? What if the child, your child, dies and all the assets go to their spouse and their spouse remarries? Then your grandkids are cut out, potentially. And so when we start exploring into these options, we realize that clients are very concerned about how their inheritance is being handled once it gets down to the child's level. So instead of giving the assets outright to the child, what we're doing is allowing that inheritance to go in trust for the child. Again, an irrevocable trust that's created at that point in time, usually the surviving spouse's death, mom's death, let's just say, if dad dies first. And the assets then have the child as both trustee and beneficiary, so you have that same degree of control that we discussed with respect to the decedent's share of the community property trust and the survivor. And yet those assets are in an irrevocable trust so that no third-party creditor can get at those assets. And when your child passes, those assets then pass down to your grandchildren, which is something that 99.9% of our clients want. And so it's a really great benefit tool. And then depending on what Hank was talking about, the beneficiary who may not be very good at handling money, you can even dial that back a bit. Maybe the child is a co-trustee with an independent trustee. Maybe if the beneficiary has even more problems, maybe just have an independent trustee and the child is not involved in the decision making. Maybe we set up the trust so that if the child is suffering from things that we're concerned about, like substance abuse, then we put in provisions that allow the independent trustee to monitor that. Or we even dial it even further back and make it a special needs trust if it's a type of beneficiary who is receiving government aid that has to be, you don't want the trust to be counted as a resource. So there's all these great things you can do with that one tool.
This is where when you get into irrevocable trusts, and in particular we've run into a number of times where, let's say you want to, again, the first level is we're just leaving it to our children in trust because it's just like, well, I can give you here's the money outside, or I can, if I leave it in trust, it's like I put it in a safe for you. And then I give you the combination, you're the only one that can get in the safe, right? So again, when we talked about that potential in-law that becomes an outlaw, well, guess what? They don't have the combination. They can't get in that safe. If, God forbid, your child got into, you know, and let's blame the in-law again, right? Let's say that they had a bad business dealing and they go through a bankruptcy. Well, that sucks your child into that type of thing as well, or they get into tax problems with the IRS. Even super creditors like that can't get in that safe at those assets you've left for your child. So this is one of those ways that you can set up protections for them, all right, that they cannot set up for themselves, and for that matter, you couldn't even set up for yourself. This is unique in the way that it works and quite easily done just in the way these estate planning documents are drafted up. The other part that comes in, as we talked about with irrevocable trust, real easy to put them in there in that way. And we've used this a lot of times where, as Russ was talking about, if you've got a child that maybe is just not good with money and they need a little assistance, someone that can work with them so they don't make bad decisions. They've got, takes two kind of thing to be able to spend that money, if you will, or to make the money decisions. That's a way that you can help them, both guide them and get them some guidance, as well as make sure they don't run out of money. You can also, by the way, you can turn it into how you control the flow of money to them. So an example, I had a gentleman years ago, and he was concerned. He had two sons, and he says, I don't think they're going to plan well for the retirement, and I want to take care of them. So when I'm gone, what I want is I want the money left in trust, and I want it to grow until they're 65, and then when they're 65, I want it to pay out to them for 15 years. So we literally set up basically kind of annuities for them within the trust that said they grow for, to age 65, and then from 65. Now, in this situation, the monies can be invested in any way. You can, whether you use an annuity up front, or whether we just put it into an investment account, all right, and we let it grow until they're 65, and then at 65 we can have a payout direct from the trust, from the investment accounts, or we can have it go into an immediate annuity, which guarantees that stream of payments. There's all kinds of ways to make that work. But basically, he just created two private pensions, didn't he, for his children, so that they, during their retirement years, would have not just be dependent on Social Security as an example. So that's just one way that we've been able to use them, and there's a myriad of others, and we'll get into those. And we're going to talk about some more about how irrevocable trusts play in. Russ mentioned special needs. Well, there's some other areas there where you can use trusts to help protect those you love. All right, we're going to get into that when we return. Join us here. Quick break, and we'll be right back on the Retirement Report.